All right. This week and next, and partially the week after that, we're going to be spending the rest of our time in wisdom literature. We're taking another break from narrative. We read the story of Solomon. We're going to cover basically the rest of Solomon's wisdom between tonight and next week. And even, I believe, the week after that is partially Ecclesiastes, and partially we have the first story of the divided kingdom. I'm not sure on the 2 Sundays from now which one we're going to do in the morning and in the evening, but we're spending a lot of our time over the next few weeks in the wisdom literature. We've already covered, of course, 2 of the wisdom books. Sometimes, I keep using the word wisdom. If you look in your Bibles at the sort of the breakdown in the Old Testament in the front, you might have it as books of poetry instead of books of wisdom. I like the nomenclature wisdom more because while Psalms is a lot poetry, the rest of them are not as much poetry. In fact, you could even say maybe that the prophets have more poetry than the wisdom books, just from a sheer state of grammar and stylistic choices. These are books that are about the wisdom, and when we use the word wisdom, we're thinking about the ways that ancient peoples thought about how to live life, what's the purpose of life, what's the meaning of life, how can we live a good life, like some of the deeper questions of reality and human experience. That's what we're considering when we think about the wisdom literature. We've talked about Job already. We talked way at the beginning of the year about Job. We've finished talking about Psalms already, which is part of this wisdom literature. Psalms is very poetic, obviously. And now we're into Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. And it's worth taking some time to think about the wisdom literature of the Bible as a whole. First and foremost, and this is perhaps the most important distinction to make, the Israelites did this, the distinction between wisdom and law. We just talked about it, was it last week, in the idea of righteousness in Psalms? I think it was last Sunday night. We talked a lot about righteousness in Psalms. There's a lot of good information about holiness in Job and Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. But the Israelites did not view these books as prescriptive in the same way that they read the law of Moses. The distinction becomes especially apparent as we get into Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, where we're not thinking about, we shouldn't be reading Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon in the same way we read a book like Leviticus, where there's very clear commands and very clear instructions, and this is what you expect if you don't do these things exactly right. There's an element of reading things in the law that you wouldn't do when you come to the wisdom literature. There are quite a few, especially in Proverbs, we'll talk about a couple tonight, seemingly contradictory instructions in the wisdom literature, where the wisdom literature will say, do this, and then it'll say, well, do the exact opposite thing. And it requires elements of discernment in reading these things that in the law, structured as it is very much in the prescriptive way, you need to do these things exactly how I say them. This is from God's perspective, right? Written in a very specific way that the wisdom literature is not. It's not intended to be read in the same way. 3 things I want you to remember as we enter the book of Proverbs. First, we need to remember general versus specific. Proverbs and Psalms, very broad books. They cover a large section of human experience, a large portion of holiness and righteousness and the way we relate to God and lament and praise and all these different kinds of things. Whereas when we get to Job, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, they are very focused, very narrow. Job is about suffering. Song of Solomon is about sex. Ecclesiastes is about purpose. What's the point? What's the point of all this? And we're getting into, when we read Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, we've already talked about Job, we're getting into very directed, focused sections of the text on specific questions in life, versus something like Proverbs, which we'll talk about tonight and next week. We talk about Proverbs, very general, very broad. And this brings us to the second thing that I want you to note, probabilities versus promises. There's a lot of stuff in Proverbs that is generally true, but is not always specifically true. The best example of this, I tried to think of a better example, I just don't think there is. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. That is generally true. We all know specific cases where that was not true, right? We all know specific cases where a child was trained up in the right way, and when they became adults, they left. Now, if you're reading the book of Proverbs, the way you read Leviticus or Deuteronomy, then you would be led to the assumption or the interpretation that if your child left the faith as an adult, it's because you did something wrong. If we're reading Proverbs the way we read Leviticus, that's the only outcome. But this is where we get to the point of probabilities versus promises. Proverbs is about things that are generally, most of the time, going to be true. They're not always true. And you should not be reading Proverbs the way that you read a book like Leviticus or Deuteronomy. In the law, God promises that he will enforce certain consequences for certain behaviors. That was what we would call imposed consequence. That is, God says, you don't do these things, then here's what I'm going to do to you. Or if you do these things, this is what I'm going to do to you. When we come to the wisdom books, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, much more about natural consequence. That is to say, if you behave this way, well, probably this will be the result. Not always, but probably this is going to be the result, the natural consequences of your behavior. So we come back to that passage, train up a child in the way he should go. When he is old, he will not depart from it. Again, that's generally true. Like if you do a good job as a parent, you teach your kids, you bring them up in the wisdom and instruction of the Lord, you're going to be more likely to be successful and have faithful children when your kids are grown, they'll remain faithful. On the other hand, again, we all know where that's not the case sometimes. Specifically, that's not the case. So we have to be careful in thinking about probabilities versus promises. These are probabilities that probably will happen, generally true, observations about life, but we can think of specific cases where they're not true. And there's always corner cases, things that are unusual, things that are out of the norm. And so that brings us to the last idea of principles versus precepts. Proverbs contain a lot of principles that require extra work to figure out how to apply to our lives. We're going to use the word, that D word that I use too much probably, discernment. We're going to use that word a lot as we talk about Proverbs, rather than the plain reading of the law. The law was very much designed, you're going to read the law, you're going to know what God wants, you're going to do what God says. This is what it is. Proverbs is not that way. There are a lot of principles that require a little bit extra work in discerning how to apply. This is a great example in Proverbs 26, 4 through 5. These verses come right after each other in the text. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Well, which one is it, Solomon? Which one am I supposed to do? And if you're reading this as you read the prescriptive books, like Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, leads us to a conundrum. Well, which am I supposed to do? Should I answer a fool or not? The first verse, verse 4, answer not a fool according to his folly. The next verse, answer a fool according to his folly. Well, which is it? We're going to have to this is going to require a little bit more thought to figure out. And in fact, Proverbs does kind of begin with this idea in Proverbs 1:6. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. There's a lot of things in Proverbs that are a little more complicated, a little more nuanced, a little more, require a little bit more thought. Here, if we're going to try to understand what Proverbs 26, 4, and 5 is saying to us, well, we have different ways of thinking about the idea of according to his folly. That can mean different things in each circumstance. In the first case, answer not a fool according to his folly, that's probably saying answer not a fool in the same way that he talks. Like he's talking like a fool, don't talk like that fool, or you become a fool, right? He's being dumb, he's being foolish. Don't answer him like that. Like be wiser in your answers. Second time, answer a fool according to his folly. Well, here we're not saying, it's not like Solomon's turning around and saying, oh, now you need to act like a fool. Rather, we do need to understand the behavior, understand what he's doing, how he is being foolish, so that I can give him the appropriate answer, the thing that he specifically needs to hear. Because there's a lot of different kinds of folly, there's a lot of different kinds of foolishness, there's a lot of different kinds of sin, and not all answers are good for everyone. I should not talk to somebody struggling with one sin, necessarily, the way that I'm going to talk to somebody struggling with a different sin. So we have to put a little bit more work into it. That's okay. That's part of the stated, explicit goal of Proverbs. We have to put a little more work into it. But this is not going to be something you could just a lot of it is, but a lot of it's not just going to be something you just read it and the surface level, and there it is, and that's what you do. It's going to require a little bit more thought, a little more discernment as we go through the wisdom literature. This is also true of books like Job. We've already talked about Job. This is also true of books like Job, where Job and his three friends, they're going around in this argument about why is there suffering? Why do bad things happen specifically to good people? And if there are things that happen that are bad, does that mean that the person was sinful? Well, again, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Because sometimes good people suffer, and sometimes bad people suffer, right? Sometimes bad people are successful, but also sometimes good people are successful. So as Job and his three friends are having this argument about suffering, really the end result that they come to, and the end result of the book, is you just need to trust God. You just need to trust that God knows what's going on. God is in control of it. And that's God's whole point when it comes down to Job and the whirlwind. If you can tell me all these things, then I will answer your question. And of course, Job can't. He can't answer all those things. None of us can. And so, again, we're thinking about wisdom literature in a little bit of a different way than we would think about the prescriptive literature or the law sections of the Old Testament. So the goal of Proverbs, explicitly stated in the first section, to help the reader wisely approach life. Proverbs 1:1-6. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple. Note, if you will, the word simple. We'll come back to this word a lot. To give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning. Let the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. There again, that word riddle is instructive. It's going to lead us into some places in Proverbs where we really have to work to understand what's being said. And so the goal of Proverbs then is to figure out how can we wisely approach life? How can we wisely approach the problems of life, the things that we're doing, in a way that leads to righteousness, justice, equity, in a way that leads us into guidance and understanding? How can we understand this stuff? The word simple is an instructive one. Life is complex. If you haven't learned that by now, I don't know what's been going on in your life. You're probably a child. Life is complex. There's a lot of competing factors, a lot of people in our lives that want different things. We're pulled between family and job and government. We're pulled between what we want and what other people want. There's a lot of things in life that are complicated, and it requires knowledge and discernment and wisdom to navigate well, unlike the simple person. The person who just does whatever the easiest thing is, just accepts whatever information they're given, just goes with the flow, no matter what is around them. The simple is a word that is used often in Proverbs to describe the person who is not wise. It's sometimes fool. There's a lot of fool, obviously. But the word simple, I think, has a bit of a deeper connotation than just somebody who's foolish, in that the simple person is not thinking things through. The simple person is not putting in the effort required to live a good life. The simple person is just sort of doing whatever comes along and isn't really thinking too hard about it and doesn't really interrogate their own beliefs and doesn't really think about the consequences of their actions. Their thoughts are simple. That is, they have a hard time thinking deep thoughts. And it's kind of an insult, but that's how the Proverbs use it. Proverbs 1:22, how long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? You can sense some exasperation here, can't you, in the words of wisdom? How long will you keep being this way, right? How long will you keep being simple? Proverbs 14:15-16, the simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thoughts to his steps. One who is wise and cautious turns away from evil, but a fool is reckless and careless. And I like the two verses coming one after the other, where we see the simple and we see the fool. We see the prudent versus the wise. There's a lot of synonyms going on in Proverbs. Proverbs is somewhat of a thesaurus book, where there'll be a verse, and then the next verse will just be synonyms for the previous verse. That happens a lot in Proverbs. Here, what is it? The simple believes everything. And I can't help but think about social media, and I can't help but think about the internet and cable news. If you just believe everything you see on the internet, you are the simple person of Proverbs. You are. The simple person believes everything they hear. But the prudent gives thought to his steps. Well, is that really true? I heard this thing. What's the evidence for that? What reasons do you have for saying that? The prudent, the wise, is cautious. Cautious because simply believing everything leads you to evil, right? Leads you into doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, believing the wrong thing. The wise person is cautious to turn away from evil, but a fool is reckless and careless. I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. We talked this morning about the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. The simple person, the foolish person, just sort of goes wherever their desires take them. I want this thing, I'm going to do that thing. I want to do this, I'm going to do that. And there's no, again, real thought to it at all. Proverbs 22:3. The prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple just goes on and suffers for it. I'm reminded of my dad's story. He grew up in New Zealand, where the sheep outnumber the people. And sheep are very dumb. I don't know if you knew that about sheep. Very dumb animals. He tells the story about this flood. It was a flash flood. There's sheep down in the gully, and there's a flash flood, and all the sheep have to do is they have to just walk up the hill. Walk up the hill. You'll be fine. And they don't. They just sit there, and the flash flood comes and washes them away, and they all die because they wouldn't walk 2 steps up the hill. That is exactly what the writer of Proverbs is talking about here. The prudent sees danger and hides himself. The simple simply go on. They just go on and suffer for it. Again, are we thinking about life in a deep way? Are we being intentional about the things we do, thinking about the things that we know, the information we receive, the things that we experience? And are we thinking through the consequences of our actions? Like, if I do X, Y, or Z thing, what's the outcome going to be? Do I even think about it? Do I even care? Or do I just do whatever I want to do and I go on and I suffer for it? And again, the word simple is a bit of an insult, but it's the default way to be. We are born simple. When you're very young, you just come out of the womb, all you care about is food and safety. That's it. That's all you care about. Well, we could say comfort maybe. I don't even know if you're thinking about safety so much. You want to be comfortable, you want to eat. That's it. And as you grow older, it takes work on the part of the parents, work on the part of the individual at some point to begin to think about things in a more complex way. Being simple is the default. That's the easy thing. I'm just going to accept what anybody tells me. I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. I'm just going to go with whatever anybody wants to do. I'm just going to go with my instinct, my impulses. That's the default way. We have to work to be wise, to be understanding. And so in essence, the book of Proverbs answers the question, how do I avoid being a simpleton who destroys my life with lack of sense? That's the question of Proverbs. And as we're going through Proverbs tonight, we'll go through Proverbs tomorrow. Not tomorrow. Nobody's going to be here tomorrow. Next Sunday morning. We're going to go through Proverbs next Sunday morning. This is what we're thinking about. How do I avoid destroying my life with lack of sense? We're going to talk about 3 things tonight, and then we'll be done. First, wisdom begins with the fear of Yahweh. This is overwhelmingly in the wisdom literature the first point to be made. Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. 9:10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. 15:33, the fear of the Lord is instruction and wisdom, and humility becomes before honor. We could even go to Job. Job 28:28, he said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. Ecclesiastes 12:13, the end of the matter, all has been heard, fear God and keep his commandments. That's it. This is all of man's duty. This is man's all. In some translations, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If you want to stop being a simple person, the very first thing, is to begin to fear the Lord. This word fear is sometimes used, as I think sometimes we use it, in the context of like respect or reverence or awe. But if we're going from being simple to complex in our thinking, again, that's the arc of wisdom literature, that we're going from being simple to complex in our thinking, then the beginning of the simple thoughts that we're trying to get out of the simpleton way of being is not reverence or respect, it's phobia. It's fear. That word phobos in the Greek, I don't know what it is in Hebrew, I should have looked it up. But it's dread or terror. right? We have fear of the Lord. Because I know that the Lord, he is the one who has ultimate power. He is the one who has ultimate authority. He is the one, especially in Israel, and you're thinking about this in the context of the Israelite nation, God tells them over and over, if you obey my commandments, things will go well. And if you don't obey my commandments, things will not go well. And so as you're raising your children, you're trying to bring them up out of being simple, in the words of Proverbs, the first thing is fear God. Fear God, not your parents, although you should, in some sense, fear your parents, not the government, although, again, maybe you should fear going to jail. Don't fear your friends. Don't fear physical harm, although a lot of those things do happen in life. But the beginning part of wisdom is fear of God. And then there's some synonyms, not synonyms, but some extensions here. Knowledge of the Holy One is insight. Humility comes before honor. Turning away from evil is understanding. All of these are basically things about keeping his commandments. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Really, this is a facet of humility, isn't it? That I'm recognizing that I am not the most important thing in the world. Again, that's the simple way of thinking. I'm the main character of life, and what I want matters the most. That's the default way to be. But this fear of God manifests as humility. That I'm submitting myself, lowering myself under his authority and power. And this idea of humility is the other two main themes of Proverbs. And we're thinking about, how do I avoid being a simpleton who destroys my life with lack of sense? First, begin to fear God. Second, you need to be willing to be corrected. This is point number 2. And again, it's another facet of humility, that if you want to be a wise person, you have to accept correction. And of course, this begins very early on with children. One of the reasons we already referenced the verse, train up a child in the way he should go. One of the reasons you need to train up a child is because your child needs corrected. Your child, his or her natural instincts are not going to get them very far. Not going to be the right way to go. And so as parents, we have to discipline, correct, and as we grow as children, we will become wise to the extent that we are willing to be corrected. Now, this doesn't just apply to children. This applies to everyone. Are you willing to hear when you are wrong? Proverbs 1:23. If you turn at my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit to you. I will make my words known to you. Now, Proverbs 1:23 is being written from the perspective of personified wisdom. Wisdom herself, which Proverbs does several times, anthropomorphizes wisdom. Wisdom here is saying this. If you turn at that is wisdom's reproof, I will pour my spirit to you and I will make my words known to you. But you have to listen. You have to listen to what I say that corrects you. Proverbs 3:11, my son, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of his reproof, for the Lord reproves him who he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights. We already talked about that idea of parenting. Proverbs 9:9, give instruction to a wise man and he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase in learning. Proverbs 15:31, the ear that listens to life-giving reproof will dwell among the wise. Whoever ignores instruction despises himself, but he who listens to reproof gains intelligence. The only way to learn what you don't know is to be told what you don't know. Well, that's not the only way. You can do it by experience. Not a pleasant way to learn, but it does happen. To the extent that we are willing to listen when others tell us that we're wrong, we will come out of, and again, we're following the arc from being a simple thinker to a complex thinker, simple thinker to if we're using the biblical word, a simple thinker to a discerning thinker. Part of that transition process requires reproof, correction, and discipline. Of course, that's what Paul tells Timothy, right? All scripture is breathed out by God and is profitable for correction and teaching and rebuke. A lot of those words that we talk about in 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are correction and improvement words, that when something is wrong, you say it. And if somebody's willing to listen to that, then they'll be wiser. They will become more of a right thinker in life if you are willing to be corrected. On the other hand, if you are not willing to listen to correction, what does he say? Whoever ignores destruction despises himself. You're the only one being hurt when you don't listen to what other people have to say that might make you wiser. If you think, I know all the things I need to know, I don't need any more information, I don't need any more knowledge, congratulations, you're a simple person. Not in the good way. You've become a simple person in the insult way of Proverbs. The last thing, learning from past generations. A lot of Proverbs focuses on how we listen to people who might know more than us, right? Who maybe have gained more experience than we have. Proverbs 1:8-9, hear my son, your father's instruction. Forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck. 6:20, my son, keep your father's commandment. Do not forsake your mother's teaching. Bind them on your heart always. Tie them around your neck. Now, we should pause here, because this is another great example of the general versus specific. Or, we might say it the second way, the principle versus the precept. Because guess what? Some people have parents that are terrible, right? That are terrible in that they don't love God, they don't want to do what God wants, they have no desire to be pleasing to God. Some people have parents not just that are terrible in the sense they don't love God, but are terrible in the sense that they just don't know much about life. They just don't have good advice. So this is a general, not a specific, a general idea in Proverbs that we're listening to past generations, even if your parents are terrible. Maybe they have some good stuff to say, but especially for us within the church, it's not just about my biological parents. It's about people in the church who have lived more of life. If nothing else, we're thinking about submit yourselves to the elders, right? Those who know more than you, presumably because they are elders, they have lived a life that has demonstrated righteousness. And maybe it's not the elders, specifically those three guys in our congregation, but there are older people in this congregation who have lived more of life than I should say you, it's me, because I'm relatively young, who we might learn from if we don't think, I know everything that's good, I know everything that's right, and the old generation, they're a bunch of fuddy-duddies and they don't know anything. Again, if that's the attitude I have, I've become the simple person. That's the default mode. You can go back to Aristotle, go back to Plato. All of them complaining about how the new generation, they don't listen to anything that the older generation says. This is a basic human problem. So one of the things about Proverbs is listening and learning from past generations. Proverbs 23:22, listen to your father who gave you life. Do not despise your mother when she is old. Buy truth. And do not sell it by wisdom, instruction, and understanding. And when we think about it logically, who's going to do all the instructing that the wise person is going to hear and accept? If we're going back to the previous point, you need to be willing to listen to correction. Well, who's going to be doing that correcting? Well, a lot of times it's going to be your parents. Sometimes it's not going to be your parents. It's going to be other people at church who have done what you've done, who have been where you've been. And if you're not willing to learn, then you're going to stay simple. You're going to stay in that mode of being simple. The simple person thinks that he knows best. He doesn't need anyone else. He doesn't need anyone to tell him any better, be it God or parents or anyone at all. He just listens to whatever anybody says. It's kind of ironic. There's sort of a balance of why it's the fear God and keep his commandments. That's the first point of wisdom. The beginning of wisdom is fear God. Because we tend to listen to all the people who are around us that tell us what we want to hear. Isn't that what we do? And again, I come back to the internet. I'm going to come back to the internet a lot on talking about Proverbs. We have the ability to craft our media consumption, to shape it in such a way that I only ever hear the things I want to hear. I only ever hear things that already agree with what I believe. If that is how you have shaped your media consumption, you are going to stay simple. There's no way around it. You're going to stay as the simple person if you only ever listen to things that already agree with what you think. The simple person wants that validation, needs that validation and reassurance. I know what's best, and how do I know that? Because I keep hearing this from everybody. Well, I'm the one who picked who's going to tell me what I need to hear. This is why it begins with fear God. Not your friends or your neighbors or your favorite politician or, put whoever you want to put in there. Fear God and keep his commandments. We'll end with the call of wisdom. The Proverbs do this quite often. They personify wisdom as sort of an entity that is seeking people who will listen. Proverbs 8:12. I, wisdom, dwell with prudence. I find knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is hatred of evil. Pride and arrogance in the way of the evil and perverted speech I hate, but I have counsel and sound wisdom. I have insight. I have strength. By me, kings reign. Rulers decree what is just. By me, princes rule. And nobles, all who govern justly. I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently find me. The idea, again, this sort of poetic language here. You want to be wise, you have to diligently seek wisdom. She doesn't just come to whoever. It requires prudence, knowledge, diligence. It requires seeking wisdom if you want to be wise. Proverbs 9:1, wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She had slaughtered her beasts. She has mixed her wine. She has set her table. She has set out her young women to call from the highest places in the town. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. To him who lacks sense, she says, come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine that I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and live and walk in the way of insight. Wisdom wants to be found. And of course, we know personified wisdom, it's God, right? God is the one who is calling. God is the one who is saying, here is the right way to live. Here is the way to be that is not simple and leads you to destruction and leads you to heartache and pain. Here is the way you should go. But a lot of times we don't answer the call, right? Where God is reaching out to us, it might be through our friends, it might be through people at church, it might be through our own reading of the Bible. Where God is reaching out all the time, this is the way to live. And if we're in that simple mode of being, we think, I don't need God. I don't need to do what he wants. I don't need to live his ways. And to quote Keith said this a lot, Keith Davis, for those who are new, how's that working out for you? How is that working out for you? Living the way of the simple, who simply do whatever they want, do whatever feels natural, do whatever anybody else says. That will ultimately lead you to a life of pain and heartache and difficulty. As we're going over the Proverbs the next few weeks, these are some of the things we're going to think about, not just Proverbs, but Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. We're going to be thinking about some of these things. We're going to end tonight with 662, All to Jesus I Surrender. Again, including not just my sin, not just the bad things in my life, but I'm surrendering to Jesus my own way of thinking. That it's not just about me and what I want, it's about what Jesus wants. It's about what he says. And so we offer the invitation, if you're ready to do that, come while we stand and sing.